The late afternoon sun hung low over the quiet streets of Glenwood, a picturesque suburb lined with towering oaks and carefully manicured lawns. Olivia Harris, a retired history professor in her mid-60s, adjusted her sun hat as she strolled along the familiar sidewalk, the cool autumn breeze rustling the golden leaves at her feet. Her Rottweiler, Brutus, trotted loyally beside her, his muscular frame moving with a confidence that reflected her own. Glenwood had been her home for over 3 decades, a place where she and her late husband, Charles, had built a life, raised their children, and established deep roots. But no matter how long she lived here, she was aware of the unspoken boundaries, the quiet judgments hidden behind polite smiles. She had learned to navigate them with dignity, holding her head high and refusing to let prejudice steal her sense of belonging. As Olivia turned onto Maple Lane, she sensed it before she saw it, a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible tension. Brutus's ears perked, his body stiffening as his sharp canine instincts registered the approaching threat. A dark pickup truck had slowed to a crawl a few houses behind her, its engine humming ominously in the otherwise peaceful evening. A low growl rumbled from Brutus's throat, deep and warning. Olivia glanced over her shoulder, her heartbeat quickening as she caught sight of 4 men inside the truck. Their eyes locked onto her like hunters sizing up prey. They were young, mid to late 20s, with broad shoulders and cocky smirks. Their laughter, sharp and taunting, carried through the crisp air, shattering the serenity of the moment. Olivia kept walking, tightening her grip on Brutus's leash. Keep moving, don't engage. But she knew avoidance would only delay the inevitable. Nice dog, one of them called out, his voice laced with mockery. Olivia said nothing, her pace steady. Brutus let out another low growl, his thick neck muscles coiling like a tightly wound spring. Where you headed so fast? Lady, another voice sneered. Footsteps scraped against the pavement. They were getting out of the truck. Olivia inhaled sharply but didn't break stride. If she showed fear, they'd pounce. The tallest of them stepped directly into her path, blocking her way with a smirk that sent a chill down her spine. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket, a chain dangling from his belt loop. That's a nice necklace you got there, he said, tilting his chin toward the gold pendant resting just above her collarbone. It was a gift from Charles, something she never took off. Olivia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. It's a beautiful evening, isn't it? She said evenly, her voice calm despite the tension clawing at her chest. Brutus moved closer, his powerful frame pressing against her leg like a sentry awaiting command. His growl deepened, more menacing now. The man chuckled, but his eyes darkened. Ain't no harm in admiring something nice, right? Admire from a distance, Olivia replied, her voice sharp. I don't have anything to give you. The other 3 men flanked their leader, forming a semi-circle around her. She knew the signs, predators closing in on their target. Come on now, the red-haired one snickered. We ain't trying to hurt you. Just hand over the necklace and the bracelet, and we'll be on our way. Olivia's fingers twitched against Brutus's leash. You think you can just take what you want? She said, steel lacing her tone. The tallest man shrugged. Lady, let's not make this difficult. You're just some old black woman walking alone. Who do you think is gonna care? Olivia's stomach tightened at the vile truth in his words. She knew the undercurrents of their town, the ones that emboldened men like these, made them believe they could get away with anything. You picked the wrong woman, she said, her voice unwavering. The leader's smirk twisted into a sneer. No, ma'am, you picked the wrong fight. He lunged forward, reaching for the necklace. Brutus exploded into motion. With a guttural snarl, he lunged, his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's forearm before he could make contact. The attacker let out a strangled scream, stumbling back as Brutus yanked him with terrifying force. Get him off me, he howled, flailing as Brutus's teeth sank deeper into his jacket. The other men froze for a split second, their bravado crumbling in the face of the snarling beast. I warned you, Olivia said coolly, taking a firm stance. Brutus, hold. Brutus obeyed instantly, his grip loosening just enough to let the man stagger backward, clutching his wounded arm. The air pulsed with tension, the remaining 3 men now eyeing the massive Rottweiler with newfound wariness. One of them, emboldened by the moment, made the mistake of lunging forward. Brutus reacted with lightning speed, snapping his jaws just inches from the man's thigh, making him stumble back in a panic. "This ain't worth it," the red-haired one shouted, his voice shaking. "Let's go." The leader, still nursing his injured arm, cursed under his breath. "No way. Not until we—" The distant wail of sirens cut through the night. The men's heads whipped around in panic. Olivia exhaled, her muscles tensing with relief. Someone had seen. Someone had called. The red-haired man took off toward the truck without another word. The other two hesitated before following, their bravado crumbling entirely as the approaching police lights reflected off nearby windows. The leader cursed again, stumbling after them. Brutus stood his ground, his ears perked as he watched them retreat. Olivia didn't move, her breath steady, her pulse still hammering. The truck screeched away just as a police cruiser rounded the corner. Within moments, an officer was stepping out, his hand hovering near his holster as he approached. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Olivia and Brutus. She nodded, exhaling slowly. "Thanks to him," she said, patting Brutus's head. The officer's gaze followed the direction of the fleeing truck. "We'll track them down," he assured her. Olivia looked down at her faithful companion, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I have no doubt." The air thickened with menace as Olivia Harris stood her ground, her breath steady but her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The men's bravado was still intact, their smirks unwavering, their cruel laughter slicing through the evening quiet like a blade. They truly believed they had her outnumbered, that she was just another helpless old woman ripe for the taking. But they hadn't accounted for Brutus. The leader, clutching his injured arm, still exuded arrogance despite the blood soaking into his sleeve. He exchanged a glance with his companions, giving them a barely perceptible nod. It was all the confirmation Olivia needed. They weren't done. The way they shifted, the way their fingers curled into fists, the glint of desperation in their eyes, she recognized it all. They weren't going to let this go. Not yet. One of them lunged, his arms outstretched to rip the necklace from her throat. Olivia barely had time to react before Brutus, a mass of fury and muscle, launched himself forward, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's wrist. A blood-curdling scream shattered the night as Brutus yanked the attacker backward with terrifying force, dragging him to the ground like a rag doll. The man thrashed, his free hand clawing at the pavement, his eyes wide with sheer terror. "Get him off me," he shrieked, his bravado obliterated. The other two hesitated now, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. The leader cursed, taking a cautious step back. He had underestimated her. More importantly, he had underestimated the unwavering loyalty and sheer power of her protector. Olivia took a step forward, her voice steady but sharp as steel. "I told you to walk away." But they weren't quite ready to surrender. The red-haired one, rage overtaking common sense, grabbed a metal pipe from the truck and swung wildly. Brutus dodged, his movements fluid and precise. The pipe clanged against the pavement, sending sparks flying, but the distraction gave the man still trapped beneath Brutus the chance to scramble free. Cradling his mangled wrist against his chest, Olivia felt the shift in the fight. The men were no longer as sure of themselves. She pressed the advantage, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You leave now, or you won't walk away at all." Another growl from Brutus, deep and guttural, sent a fresh wave of fear washing over them. The leader, now pale and furious, weighed his options. The moment stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then, from the distance, salvation came in the form of wailing sirens. The men stiffened. The leader's eyes darted wildly as the reality of their situation sank in. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced with something close to panic. "Damn it," he snarled. "Let's go." The red-haired man hesitated a second longer, his grip tightening on the metal pipe as though he still believed there was a chance to turn this in his favor. But one sharp glare from the leader sent him stumbling toward the truck. The injured one barely made it to the vehicle, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The last to move was the leader, his gaze locking onto Olivia's one last time. "This ain't over," he spat before climbing into the truck. Olivia didn't flinch, didn't blink, even as the tires screeched against the pavement and the truck roared off into the night. She kept her stance firm, her fingers still curled around Brutus's leash, even as her knees threatened to buckle. The sirens grew louder, A blur of flashing blue and red filling the street as a police cruiser pulled up. Officer James Carter emerged, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon as he surveyed the scene. His sharp gaze landed on Olivia first, then flickered to Brutus, still poised and alert, his teeth bared in case another fight was required. "Mrs. Harris," Carter said, his voice a mixture of concern and admiration. "Are you all right?" Olivia exhaled slowly, feeling the full weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She reached down, running a steadying hand along Brutus's back, her loyal companion pressing against her as if to keep her upright. "I am now," she said, her voice softer but just as resolute. "But if you'd been a minute later, I'm not sure they would have been." The sirens pierced the cold night air as Officer James Carter's patrol car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the desolate industrial lot, its blue and red lights flickering ominously against the steel warehouse walls. The scent of rust and damp concrete filled the air, mingling with the acrid stench of burnt rubber. Olivia Harris stood firm, her breath curling in the frigid air, one hand gripping Brutus's leash as the massive Rottweiler remained poised, his muscles still coiled with tension from the fight. Brian Tanner, the so-called leader, lay sprawled on the cracked pavement, his arm mangled from Brutus's grip. His pained groans were the only sound breaking the tense silence as the officer approached, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Carter's eyes flickered from Olivia to the battered man at her feet, taking in the shredded fabric of his jacket and the swelling already forming along his wrist. "Mrs. Harris, are you injured?" Carter's voice was steady but edged with concern. Olivia shook her head, exhaling slowly. "I'm fine." But he wasn't alone. Carter turned his gaze toward the empty alleyways, scanning the darkness beyond the glowing neon signs of a nearby auto repair shop. A truck's screeching tires had already faded into the distance, the remaining attackers vanishing into the maze of the industrial district. But one had been left behind, his arrogance and recklessness now rewarded with capture. "Hands where I can see them," Carter barked, stepping toward Tanner. The ringleader groaned but did as he was told, lifting his uninjured arm in a feeble display of surrender. Carter wasted no time securing him in cuffs, his practiced movements quick and forceful. Olivia watched as the officer read Tanner his rights, but her mind was still racing. 3 of them were still out there. 3 men who had tried to rob and assault her, believing no one would care what happened to a woman like her in a place like this. But they were wrong. Brutus let out a low growl, his ears still perked, his body still rigid. Olivia gave his head a reassuring pat, grateful beyond words for his unwavering loyalty. Carter guided Tanner to the back of the police car before turning back to Olivia. "I need you to come down to the station. Mrs. Harris, we need your statement." She nodded, tightening her coat around her shoulders as she followed Carter to his vehicle. The adrenaline had kept her warm, but now the night's chill was beginning to creep in. Brutus climbed into the back with her, his body pressed close for comfort. The ride to the precinct was quiet, save for the occasional muttered curse from Tanner. Olivia stared out the window, her mind replaying the night's events. She had been a professor, a woman of knowledge and history, not one of violence. Yet here she was, sitting in the back of a police cruiser, her heart still hammering from an attack she had barely escaped. At the station, Carter led her into a bright, sterile room where a recorder was set on the table between them. Olivia took a deep breath, pushing past the exhaustion, and recounted every detail, from the moment she first noticed the truck to Brutus's fearless defense and the men's ultimate retreat. Carter listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "You did good, Mrs. Harris," he said when she had finished. "But we're not done yet." "What happens now?" Olivia asked. "We track down the others," Carter replied. "We already have an APB out on the truck, with Tanner in custody. It won't take long before one of them slips up." And slip up they did. Within 24 hours, the police located the red-haired attacker, James Foley, holed up at a cousin's apartment, his injured wrist hastily wrapped in gauze. He hadn't expected Tanner to talk, but the leader's arrogance had crumbled under interrogation. Foley had been the first to break away when things went south, and now he would pay for his cowardice. Kyle Mercer, the third suspect, was found less than a day later, working at a mechanic shop on the city's outskirts as if nothing had happened. The security footage from nearby businesses had sealed his fate. By the time officers arrived, He was already packing a bag, his face pale with realization that his time was up. But the fourth man, the driver, was still at large. Olivia remained vigilant. She knew they wouldn't forget what had happened. Tanner's parting words still echoed in her mind. This ain't over. She didn't trust that the last one wouldn't try something desperate. And she was right. 2 nights later, while Olivia was out walking Brutus near her home, the dog suddenly tensed, his ears flicking forward. A black sedan idled at the end of the block. Its headlights dimmed. Olivia's stomach twisted. She reached for her phone. But before she could dial, the vehicle peeled away. They were watching her. She reported it immediately. And Carter reassured her they were closing in on the last suspect. Just stay alert, he warned. We'll get him. And they did. The final man, Michael Mick Lewis, was caught trying to flee the state. Stopped at a gas station just 20 miles from the border. His nerves had finally given way. And when officers surrounded his car, he surrendered without a fight. Back at the station, Olivia was given the news. A slow exhale of relief escaped her lips. It was finally over. But as she looked at Brutus, resting at her feet, she knew this wasn't just about 4 men getting caught. This was about the strength she had shown. The courage to fight back when no one expected her to. And she knew one thing for sure, she would never let fear dictate her life. Now, if you believe that justice should always prevail, and that strong women like Olivia deserve our respect, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every story like hers needs to be heard. Let's stand together in support of those who refuse to back down. Until next time, stay strong, stay vigilant, and never underestimate the power of resilience. The days following the arrests were heavy. But Olivia Harris refused to let fear consume her. She continued her routine, determined not to let the shadows of the past week dictate her future. But the weight of what had happened still pressed on her chest like an unbearable burden. The bruises on her arms had begun to fade. But the memories of that terrifying night lingered, replaying in her mind each time she closed her eyes. Brutus remained close by her side, his presence a constant reassurance that she was never truly alone. Yet the fear that had been etched into her bones would not be easily erased. 3 of them were behind bars. But one was still out there, lurking in the unknown. It was late afternoon when Olivia decided to take Brutus to the park. The autumn breeze carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. And for a moment, she allowed herself to breathe in the crisp air, trying to find solace in the rhythmic rustling of trees. Brutus trotted beside her, his ears twitching, his instincts sharper than ever. He, too, could sense her unease, the tension in her shoulders, the wary glances she threw over her shoulder. As they wandered along the trail, Olivia's gaze drifted to the empty benches, the playground where children once played now silent, and the far-off figure standing near the tree line. Her heart skipped a beat. Something about him felt familiar, the hunched posture, the way his hands fidgeted with the edge of his jacket. Brutus tensed. Her pulse quickened. Her mind screamed for her to turn around, to walk away, to leave before something terrible happened again. But she stood her ground. The man shifted uneasily, as if he had only now realized he was being watched. His head snapped up, eyes locking onto hers for a fraction of a second before he turned sharply on his heel. Mick Lewis, she breathed, recognition slamming into her like a wave of ice. The last man, the one who had gotten away. Before she could react, before she could reach for her phone, Brutus launched forward with a deep, rumbling snarl. His paws thundered against the ground, his powerful body propelling him across the grass in seconds. Mick let out a startled yelp, stumbling backward, his foot catching on an exposed tree root. He crashed to the ground, his hands flying up instinctively as Brutus pounced, planting his massive paws on the man's chest and snarling inches from his face. No, please, Mick sputtered, his voice high and trembling. Call him off. I didn't mean. Olivia approached slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared down at the man who had played a role in nearly destroying her life, watching as his entire body trembled beneath Brutus's weight. His lips quivered, his eyes darting around in search of help that would not come. Brutus growled, his lips peeling back just enough to reveal his sharp teeth. A clear warning that one wrong move could mean something much worse than an arrest. You were there that night, Olivia said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. You sat in that truck. Waiting for them to rob me. Waiting to drive them away after they got what they wanted. Mick whimpered. I didn't. I wasn't. It was Tanner. It was all him. Olivia's throat tightened. She had known it, but hearing it aloud sent a fresh wave of anger crashing through her. Tanner said no one would care. She said bitterly, her fists clenching, that an old black woman like me didn't matter. That no one would come to help me. Mick's face paled. I swear, I never wanted it to go that far. I didn't touch you. I was just the driver. Just the driver? Olivia's voice sharpened, her nails digging into her palms. You let it happen. You let them corner me. You let them attack me like I was nothing. Mick squeezed his eyes shut. I was scared. Scared? A humorless laugh escaped Olivia's lips. You're scared now because you got caught. You weren't scared when you watched them put their hands on me. When you thought you'd get away with it. A beat of silence stretched between them. The park seemed impossibly still, as if the very earth itself held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Brutus let out another low growl, his body shifting slightly, pressing Mick deeper into the cold dirt. The young man let out a whimper. Please, Mick whispered, tears pooling in his eyes. I'll talk. I'll tell them everything. Just don't let him. Olivia inhaled sharply. She wanted justice. She wanted them all to rot in prison for what they had done. But above all, she wanted this fear, this endless terror, to finally be over. She reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her phone with slow precision. Officer Carter, she said when he answered. I found him. By the time the officers arrived, Mick was sobbing, his face pressed into the dirt, his breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. Brutus stood firm until Olivia gave him a quiet command to step back. Even then, he didn't move far, his deep eyes watching Mick's every movement as the officers hauled him to his feet and secured the cuffs around his wrists. As Mick was led toward the squad car, he looked over his shoulder, his eyes pleading. I didn't want this, he whispered. Tanner, he said you wouldn't fight back. Olivia held his gaze, her voice quiet but unyielding. Then you were wrong. The squad car door slammed shut, the finality of the sound echoing through the park. Olivia exhaled, her body sagging from the weight of it all. Brutus pressed his head against her thigh. A solid, grounding presence. You did good, boy, she murmured, running her fingers through his fur. Real good. The last of them had been caught. Justice would be served, but deep inside, Olivia knew that some wounds would take much longer to heal. If you believe in justice, if you believe in standing strong no matter the odds, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Olivia's remind us that resilience matters, that even when the world doubts us, we rise. Until next time, stay strong, stay vigilant, and never let fear win. The courtroom was packed, a sea of watchful eyes, tense expressions, and hushed murmurs that rippled through the crowd as the trial began. Olivia Harris sat tall in the witness stand, her hands clasped together in a calm but firm posture. She had waited for this moment, for the chance to tell her story. To make them listen, to make them understand. Her breath was steady, but inside, her heart pounded with anticipation. Across the room, Brian Tanner sat at the defense table, his expression a careful mask of indifference. But Olivia could see it. The slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers curled against the table. He knew what was coming. The prosecutor, Jessica Nagayan, stood and approached the witness stand with calculated precision. Mrs. Harris, she began, her voice clear and unwavering. Can you tell the court what happened on the night of the attack? Olivia inhaled deeply, nodding once before speaking. I was walking my dog, Brutus, just as I had done every evening for years. I noticed a truck trailing behind me. It felt off. I tried to ignore it, to keep walking, but I could feel their eyes on me. The jury leaned in, captivated by her steady voice. The tension in the room thickened, hanging over them like a storm about to break. And then, Jessica prompted. They stopped. 4 of them got out. They surrounded me. Olivia's voice remained firm, but a flicker of the fear she had felt that night seeped through. They taunted me, said no one would care what happened to me, that I was nothing. A murmur swept through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Jessica turned to the jury. And did they harm you? They tried, Olivia said, her gaze unwavering, but Brutus didn't let them. At the mention of her loyal companion, a brief, knowing smile flickered across her lips. The jury was hooked now. drawn into the terrifying reality she had faced. Jessica nodded, stepping aside as the bailiff rolled in the television screen. "If it pleases the court," she said, glancing at the judge before pressing play. "We have security footage that captured the incident." The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the grainy black and white footage played. The jury watched as the truck slowed. As the men got out, their postures predatory, their confidence unwavering. Then they saw Olivia, standing alone, her dog at her side, bracing herself as the men closed in. And then, chaos. Brutus lunging, the men scrambling, the leader, Tanner, trying to grab Olivia's necklace before Brutus knocked him to the ground. The footage ended with the men fleeing, the sound of sirens growing louder in the distance. Jessica turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed the reality of what happened that night. These were not misguided young men. This was a coordinated attack. They assumed Mrs. Harris was weak, that no one would fight for her." She gestured to Olivia, but they were wrong. The defense attorney, Robert Clemens, stood, adjusting his tie as he prepared his counter. He offered the jury a mild smile, his tone smooth. "Mrs. Harris," he began, walking towards her, "do you believe these men intended to kill you?" "No," Olivia said simply, "but they intended to take something from me, whether it was my dignity, my safety, or my life. I can't say, but they didn't care what happened to me." Clemens nodded as if considering her words. "And yet, no one was seriously injured. Would you say that perhaps this incident escalated beyond their original intent?" Olivia's expression hardened. "You're asking if I should have let them rob me? Let them put their hands on me? Because that's what you're saying, isn't it?" Clemens faltered for a second before regaining his composure. "I'm merely suggesting that they were just boys being reckless?" Olivia interjected, "that I should have just let them have what they wanted and gone home quietly." She leaned forward, her voice sharpening. "Would you tell your mother, your sister, your daughter to do the same?" Silence. Clemens cleared his throat and turned away. No further questions. Jessica took her place again, her gaze piercing as she faced the jury. "You've heard Mrs. Harris' testimony. You've seen the footage. You've heard how these men targeted her, believing no one would care. But she stood up. She fought back. She glanced toward the defense table. And now, it's time for them to face the consequences." The judge called for a recess, and Olivia exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. The trial was far from over, but she had done what she came to do. She had spoken her truth, and now, she could only wait for justice to take its course. But what happens next? Will the jury see through the defense's excuses? Or will Tanner and his men manage to escape the justice they so rightly deserve? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to follow the rest of this gripping courtroom battle. Justice isn't guaranteed, but it is fought for. Stay tuned for the next chapter. The courtroom was electric with tension, the weight of finality pressing down on every soul present. Olivia Harris sat still, hands folded in her lap, heart pounding so violently she thought it might betray her calm exterior. The judge's gaze was unreadable as she turned to the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, an older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, stood. She held a folded piece of paper, her fingers slightly trembling as she opened it. "We have, Your Honor." The room fell into a deafening silence, all breaths held in anticipation. In the matter of the state versus Brian Tanner, James Foley, Kyle Mercer, and Michael Lewis, we find the defendants guilty on all charges. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, allowing the relief to wash over her. But just as quickly, her mind reminded her, justice was only real if the sentence truly reflected the crime. Judge Reynolds nodded solemnly. "Thank you, members of the jury. The court acknowledges your decision. Now, we proceed with sentencing." Brian Tanner sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed he might snap his own teeth. Foley and Mercer exchanged panicked looks. But it was Mick Lewis, the so-called informant, who looked the most devastated. He had expected leniency, perhaps more than he was about to receive. The judge adjusted her glasses, setting down the jury's decision as she regarded the four men. "This court has taken into account the severity of your crimes, the premeditated attack, the intent to harm, the arrogance of believing you would walk free after what you did. These actions were not reckless mistakes of youth, they were deliberate choices. She turned her sharp eyes to Tanner first. "Brian Tanner, you orchestrated this crime, you set it in motion. You encouraged it, and you made it clear that you believed your victim was insignificant. For this, you are sentenced to 12 years in prison with no possibility of parole before serving 10. A murmur spread across the courtroom. Tanner's head snapped up, his arrogant composure cracking. 10 years? For some old lady? The judge's gavel slammed down. Silence. Her tone was razor sharp. You showed no mercy, and you will receive none here. Tanner's mouth pressed into a thin, pale line, his hands clenched into fists. The judge moved on. James Foley and Kyle Mercer. As Tanner's willing accomplices, you played your own roles in this crime. You are each sentenced to 10 years in prison, with no parole eligibility for at least 6. Foley let out a barely audible curse, while Mercer slumped in his chair, defeated. Then came Mick Lewis. Judge Reynolds sighed as she turned her attention to him. "Mr. Lewis, you have been cooperative since your arrest. Your testimony assisted in securing convictions. However, you were still an active participant in this crime. You were the getaway driver, the enabler. You did nothing to stop this from happening. For that, you are sentenced to 5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 3. Lewis exhaled sharply, nodding with evident regret. He had gotten off lighter than the others. But prison was still prison. For a moment, it seemed the sentencing was over. But then, just as the judge prepared to dismiss the court, one of the prosecution's assistants rushed forward. A file in hand, she whispered something to the prosecutor, Jessica Nagayan, who frowned deeply and stood immediately. "Your Honor, may we approach?" A ripple of unease spread through the room. The judge nodded, motioning for both counsels to step forward. The whispering between them was urgent, tension crackling in the air like static. The judge leaned back, her expression darkening. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she turned her gaze toward Tanner. "Mr. Tanner, new evidence has come to light." Olivia's stomach twisted. "What now?" The judge continued, her voice slow, deliberate. "Evidence that you have ties to a larger criminal organization. An organization that has been linked to previous hate crimes in this very county." A sharp inhale echoed from the gallery. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected Tanner was dangerous. But this? Tanner, for the first time, looked rattled. That's ridiculous." Jessica Nagayan stepped forward. "Your Honor, the prosecution has received confirmation that Brian Tanner has a history of violent, racially motivated offenses that were previously uncharged due to insufficient evidence. However, witness testimony and newly obtained forensic analysis now link him to a hate crime 2 years prior in which a black-owned business was vandalized and burned." Gasps filled the air. Tanner shook his head, his face paling. No, that's not true." Judge Reynolds silenced him with a single, damning glare. "Mr. Tanner, you were already facing a sentence for your attack on Mrs. Harris. But in light of this new evidence, I am increasing your sentence." Tanner's breathing turned ragged, his desperation clear. "You can't do that." The judge slammed her gavel down. "Watch me." She turned to the jury. "Brian Tanner, you are now sentenced to 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole before serving 15. The courtroom erupted in noise. Tanner's face contorted in disbelief, his eyes wild with panic. "No, this is a setup. This." The bailiffs moved in as he thrashed in his seat, his protests drowned out by the murmur of reporters scribbling furiously, the audience whispering in shock. Olivia watched, her hands trembling slightly. She had come here expecting justice. But now, she realized she had only seen the surface of what lay beneath. Tanner had been more dangerous than anyone knew. And now, he was going away for a long time. She exhaled, feeling Brutus press against her leg under the table. Her loyal companion had sensed her unease, offering silent comfort. Justice had been served, but the truth? The truth had been darker than she had ever imagined. As the defendants were led away, Olivia sat back, absorbing it all, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never be the woman who let fear win. If this revelation shocked you, if you believe justice should always prevail, drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. What did you think of this unexpected turn? And don't forget to like and subscribe, because this story isn't over yet. The walk home felt longer than usual. The sky had darkened, and a hush had settled over the streets. as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the weight of what had transpired. Olivia Harris clutched the leash tightly in her hands. Her steps measured, her breath steady. Brutus walked beside her, his ears twitching at every sound. Ever watchful, ever protective. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel the exhaustion creeping into her bones. Justice had been served, but the battle had left its mark on her. As she reached her porch, she hesitated, glancing down the familiar street that she had once walked with ease. Now, it felt different. She had fought for herself, for her dignity, and for every person who had been made to feel invisible. But not everyone in the neighborhood saw it that way. The next morning, the weight of reality settled in. Olivia had barely stepped outside when Mrs. Douglas, her longtime neighbor, appeared on the sidewalk, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I saw the news," she said softly, reaching out a gentle hand. "I just wanted to say how proud I am of you." Olivia smiled, though there was a heaviness in her chest. "Thank you," she said, but not everyone shared Mrs. Douglas's sentiment. As she walked to the market later that afternoon, she overheard whispers, the not-so-subtle glances from others who thought she had made too much of a fuss. One man even muttered as she passed, "Some people just love playing the victim." Olivia clenched her jaw but kept walking. She had faced worse, and she had come out stronger. Later that day, a knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, she was met with the sight of a young woman, no older than 20, standing nervously on the porch. "Mrs. Harris?" she asked, shifting her weight from foot to foot. I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" Olivia asked, surprised. The young woman glanced down, gathering her thoughts. "For standing up for yourself. For not backing down." She exhaled shakily. "A few months ago, something similar happened to me. But I was too scared to do anything about it. Watching you fight back, it made me realize I don't have to be silent." Olivia felt a lump form in her throat. "What's your name?" "Danielle." Olivia nodded, then reached out, squeezing the young woman's hand. "You are not alone, Danielle, and you never have to be silent again." That night, Olivia sat on her porch with Brutus curled up at her feet. The stars stretched endlessly above her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something close to peace. Justice wasn't just about what happened in a courtroom, it was about what came after. It was about proving that her life, her story, her fight mattered. Change was slow, but it was happening, and she would make sure it never stopped. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that no one should be made to feel invisible, leave a comment below. Let's keep this conversation going, because every voice, just like Olivia's, deserves to be heard. The scent of roasted chicken and simmering vegetables filled the air, wrapping Olivia Harris in a warmth that had nothing to do with the food on the stove. Tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't just cooking, she was celebrating. The battle had been fought. Justice had been served, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could finally breathe. Brutus sat by the kitchen door, his eyes locked on her every movement, his tail thumping against the floor in eager anticipation. She chuckled as she reached for his bowl, piling in pieces of chicken alongside his favorite roasted carrots. "You earned this, boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "We both did." She plated her own meal, setting it on the small dining table by the window. As she took her first bite, she let herself savor not just the taste but the moment itself. No more worrying about trials. No more whispers of doubt from the community. No more looking over her shoulder. She had faced the darkness head-on and emerged stronger. Her mind drifted back to that night, the fear, the desperation, the way Brutus had stood by her side without hesitation. He had been more than just a dog, he had been her shield, her guardian, a steadfast reminder that she was never truly alone. She glanced down at him now, watching as he chewed contentedly, blissfully unaware of how much he had done for her, how much he had saved her. After dinner, she grabbed his leash, and his ears perked up instantly. He knew. "Come on, let's take a walk," she murmured, stepping outside into the crisp night air. The streets were quiet, bathed in the golden glow of streetlights. The same streets where she had once felt vulnerable now felt different. Each step she took was lighter, as if she was shedding the weight of the past with every movement. Brutus walked beside her, his posture relaxed yet attentive, ever her protector. She let her mind wander. Had she changed? Perhaps. She had always been strong. But now she carried something more, an unshakable belief that she would never let fear dictate her life again. She had faced cruelty, but she had also found kindness. She had been underestimated, but she had proven that she was far from helpless. As they rounded the last corner toward home, she paused, taking in the stillness around her. The same stars that had shone above her on that fateful night were there now. Unchanged, constant, but she was different. She was no longer just a woman who had survived an attack, she was a woman who had reclaimed her life. She knelt beside Brutus, running a hand over his thick fur. "We're safe now," she whispered. He responded by pressing his head against her arm. A silent reassurance. As she stood and made her way back inside, a gentle smile graced her lips. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. But she was ready, because no matter what lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain: she and Brutus had already won. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of resilience and the bond of loyalty, leave a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe, because stories like Olivia's deserve to be told. The story of Olivia Harris is more than just an account of justice served. It is a testament to the power of resilience, the unwavering loyalty of companionship, and the unyielding demand for accountability in the face of injustice. In every chapter of this journey, Olivia proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it. Her story is one that echoes through time, reminding us all that silence is never the answer, and that strength is found not only in resistance but in perseverance. Racial injustice remains a harsh reality in today's world, but Olivia's unwavering defiance in the face of discrimination serves as a beacon of hope. Society often underestimates individuals like her, black, elderly, living in a community that is slow to acknowledge its own prejudices. But Olivia refused to be pushed aside. Her courage proved that black lives do matter, that voices long ignored must be heard, and that justice is not a privilege but a right for all. Her fight was not just for herself but for every person who has been judged, disregarded, or made to feel invisible. And then there was Brutus. More than just a pet. He was her protector, her guardian, her unwavering ally in times of crisis. Loyalty and bravery are not limited to people, they are qualities that transcend species, existing in the bond between those who love and protect each other. Brutus did not hesitate to stand beside Olivia when danger threatened. He faced down 4 men without fear, reminding us that true loyalty is measured not by words, but by actions. In our own lives, we often take for granted the ones who stand beside us, whether they are family, friends, or even the silent, watchful presence of a beloved pet. Olivia's story teaches us to cherish those who remain steadfast in our darkest moments, for they are the ones who make us stronger. Justice and accountability go hand in hand. The court did not waver in delivering severe sentences to the men who attacked Olivia. It sent a message: crime has consequences, and society will not tolerate those who seek to harm others out of hatred and malice. But justice is not always swift, nor is it always guaranteed. Too often, victims of racial injustice are ignored, their attackers walking free without repercussions. Olivia's case was different because she fought. She stood up and refused to be silenced. And because of her, the court was forced to listen. The lesson here is clear: change does not come from waiting. It comes from action. It comes from demanding that those who do wrong be held accountable. Strength in the face of hate is what defines true power. Olivia defied stereotypes, showing that age and race do not equate to weakness. The men who attacked her believed she was an easy target, someone they could intimidate without consequence. But they were wrong. Her intelligence, her strength, and her unwillingness to back down turned the tide against them. And isn't that a lesson we all need to carry forward? That in a world that often seeks to diminish us, our greatest power lies in refusing to be diminished. Olivia's story resonates because it is real. Maybe not in the exact details, but in its essence: the battles against discrimination, the fight for justice, the unexpected allies who stand by our side. We all face struggles, moments where we feel unseen, unheard, and underestimated. But what we do in those moments defines who we are. Will we back down, or will we rise? Her story is a call to action for all of us. To stand up when we see injustice, to protect those who need us, to demand accountability and never let hatred go unchallenged, to recognize that courage is not about being fearless, but about moving forward even when fear is present. If Olivia's story moved you, if you believe in standing against injustice, if you cherish loyalty and bravery in all its forms, take a moment now. Like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and most importantly, follow this channel so you don't miss the next story of resilience, justice, and triumph. Because stories like Olivia's are not just tales to be told, they are lessons to be lived.